This chapter will focus on using the knight in various pawn-skeleton situations. Of all the pieces of our army, the knight is certainly the most difficult to master. The knight is the one piece that is able to jump over friendly and unfriendly forces. Its strange L-shaped movement is difficult to get used to. For these reasons, and many others, the knights are unappreciated for all the goodness they can bring to a position. Here are some practical things to keep in mind. Knights are not long-range pieces. To be effective, they have to be close to the action. Here we have a knight on A1. How many squares does he control? Only 2. The C2 and B3 squares. Pretty bleak. This is the reason for the witticism, "A knight on the rim is dim." Imagine that all the action was on the king side, say the G8 square. It would cost white 5 moves to bring his knight to G8. He would try a tour like knight A1, B3, D4, F5, E7, G8. By the time the knight made the trip, the action might have shifted to the queen side, and the tour has to take place all over again. This brings us to a crucial understanding. To be effective, knights must be centralized. Here we see white's knight attacking 8 squares. Brilliant! Whether the action is on the king side or queen side, the knight will have no difficulties making himself a part of the scene. However, this presents a problem. If knights have to be centralized, it means they will have to be protected, or else they will be driven off their squares. This means that knights must have secured outposts. In this position, white's outposts are the B5, D5, and F5 squares. The reason why is that these are the squares that are protected by white's pawns. The B5 and F5 squares, however, are not secured. That is, black could drive a knight away by playing A7, A6, or G7, G6. The only secured outpost is the D5 square. From black's perspective, his is exactly the mirror image of white's line of reasoning. Now we add a pair of knights to the position. Here the race is on for both sides to try to bring their knights to their outposts. White starts with 1 knight E2. This is superior to 1 knight F3, which attacks a pawn and is quite attractive. The only problem is that after 1 knight F3, G6, white's knight hasn't reached one of his outposts. If he continues with 2 knight H4, black's playing G6 keeps white's knight out of the F5 square, and he will be forced to rethink his path. Black matches white's first move. 1 knight E7, 2 knight C3, knight C6, 3 knight D5, knight D4. Both sides have played very well and have moved their knights to the best outposts available. In this diagram, white has moved his knight to the D5 outpost when he might have preferred to move it to the F5 outpost, where the knight could attack the G7 pawn. The reason he didn't do this is that the F5 outpost was unstable. It couldn't be secured. How can an outpost be secured? The answer is by pawn play. In this diagram, both players have a fairly good idea as to where they want to move their knights. The problem for white is that the d5 outpost, as nice as it is, doesn't create enough problems for his opponent. He therefore starts the race with 1 h5. The purpose of this move is to stop the response g7 to g6 when the white knight plops down on the f5 square. From the f5 square, the knight will attack the g7 base pawn. Play might continue. 1 knight f7, 2 knight c2, knight g5, 3 knight e3, knight e6, 4 knight f5. White has moved to his outpost before black could get to the d4 square. As a result, black's knight is tied to the defense of the g7 pawn. This example features a locked center pawn struggle. The knight outposts for both sides are straightforward. White would love to have a knight on the c5, d6, or f6 squares. For black, his choices are the f5, e4, or c4 squares. Knights love locked pawn formations. In such situations, they know exactly what squares to go to. What knights don't like are pawn structures that are in a great deal of flux. What was once an ideal landing square may suddenly be taken away. In this locked pawn formation, white's best outpost is the d6 square. While the c5 and even f6 squares might be nice, the f6 square is covered by the g7 pawn, while the c5 square could be covered by b7, b6. From black's point of view, the d3, e4, and f5 squares would all be nice. If black plays b7, b5, then bringing a knight to the a4 square would be attractive too. But black has to be realistic as well. How to bring a knight to the d3 square? Most likely, it would have to traverse through the f4 square. White might prevent this by g2, g3. The e4 square can be blocked by f2, f3. That leaves the f5 outpost. This could be covered by g2, g4. Therefore, in such pawn formations, the move h7, h5 is often played in order to secure the f5 square. If white plays h2, h3 in order to play g2, g4, black often continues with h5, h4 in order to prepare en passant. One of the knight's greatest uses is that of a blockader. If your opponent has a protected passed pawn, the knight does terrifically as a blockader. The reason is that the knight not only blocks the pawn, it attacks squares at the same time. Here we see that white's protected passed d5 pawn is firmly blocked from moving. Not only does the d6 knight stop the d5 pawn, it simultaneously attacks the e4 pawn. This makes the d6 knight a rather powerful piece that white wants to exchange off. To do this, white would have to move his c3 knight, which might cost his e4 pawn. White might plan to play 1 a4 and 2 knight b5, but fearing the loss of his e4 pawn, He starts with 1 f3, securing his pawn chain. White has created a new base pawn. His g2 pawn now plays a key role. Black might counter White's strategy in two ways, depending upon the needs of the position. He might play 1b6 in order to meet 2a4 with a6, stopping knight c3, b5. Or he might try to transfer White's base pawn forward. The way to do this is to attack White's pawn chain in the middle. Black might try 1 f5, 2a4, f takes e4, 3, f takes e4. Now the base pawn is no longer the g2 pawn, but is now the e4 pawn. Along the pawn chain, base pawns can be moved. One of the knight's specialties is attacking in different directions. A knight in the middle of the board can attack 8 different squares simultaneously. This gives the knight a great potential for forking the enemy pieces. This example shows the most common type of knight fork. Black's king is in check, and he can kiss his a8 rook goodbye. Forks in which the king, queen, and rook are simultaneously attacked are known as a family fork. By adding a queen, we get a family fork. All 3 black pieces are under attack at once. This ability to jump around the board and fork pieces makes the hostile knights pieces to watch out for. While knights and queens can't work together to form a battery, they do work very well together in a number of circumstances. The best-known example is the smothered mate. White seems to be having it tough. His queen is under attack, and black has a back-rank mate threat. White had better come up with something in a hurry. Fortunately, White is spared defeat by a nifty little mate. White plays 1 knight f7, check, king g8, 2 knight h6, check. Black is now in double check and must move his king. He can't play 2 king f8 as 3 queen f7 checkmate is checkmate. Black goes back to hide in his corner. 2 king h8. White could now repeat the position with 3 knight f7 check and a perpetual check and a drawn game. But with a gleam in his eye, White finds the mate. 3 queen g8 check. A fine move. Black is forced to take away his king's escape square. 3 rook takes g8, 4 knight f7 checkmate. A beautiful smothered mate. This knight smothered mate occurs in a lot of games from a number of positions. It's worth keeping in mind. Although knights move around slowly, their advantage over bishops is that they do move to both black and white squares. The following example was taken from my own practice. A rather difficult position has arisen. White's pawn skeleton tells us several things. 1. He has a protected passed pawn. 2. He has a bad bishop. 3. His knight has no chance of finding a good outpost. Black's pawn structure also reveals several things. 1. The doubled E pawns are usually a grave weakness. While White has a passed pawn on the queen side, I have little chance of creating a passed pawn on the king side. 2. Although I have doubled e-pawns, the e5 pawn is magnificent. It denies white's knight access to the d4 square and closes the a1 h8 diagonal. 3. My c6 knight perfectly blockades white's passed c5 pawn. 4. My c8 bishop is a bad one, as most of my pawns are on light squares. These revelations brought about the following plan. 1. I must activate my bishop, trying to exchange it off for white's knight. 2. I must activate my king, bringing it up the board to keep an eye on white's passed pawn while protecting my important e5 pawn. Finally, I can then move my knight around the board to the f3 outpost. My opponent, Grandmaster Alex Wojciech of Poland, now played 1. King f1, bishop e6, 2. King e1, bishop c4, 3. Knight c1. Alex notes that I am trying to exchange off my bishop for knight and tries to stop me for now. His problem, however, is that the c4 bishop dominates the knight. 3. King f7, 4. King d1, king e6, 5. King c2, knight d8. Now that the black king keeps a watchful eye over the c5 pawn, the knight begins his journey to the f3 outpost. 6. King d1, knight f7. 7. Knight e2, bishop takes e2, check. 8. King takes e2, king d5. Black is now ready to bring his knight to f3. 9. King f1. Anticipating knight f7, g5, f3, white prepares to keep his h2 pawn protected. 9. King c4, 10. Bishop e1. White is forced to retreat his bishop in order to protect his b4 pawn base. But now the bishop is on a defensive diagonal, only with hardly a place to move. 10. Knight g5, 11. King g2. If 11 c6, knight e6, and the c6 pawn will be neatly rounded up after king c4, d5 takes c6, and then king c6, d5, c4 back again. A very powerful move. White is now reduced to making only king and pawn moves. 12 h3, knight e6. Avoiding the clever trap, 12 g takes h3 check, 13 king h2, knight f3 check, 14 king takes h3, knight takes e1, 15 c6, and black's slow-moving knight cannot return in time to stop the pawn from promotion. 13 h takes g4, f takes g4, 14 king f1, knight c7, 15 king g1, knight d5, 16 king f1, h6. Losing a tempo so that white has to move. If he moves his king with 16 king g1, king e2 wins the white bishop. White is forced to give up his beautiful passed pawn, and black wraps up the game. 17 c6, knight c7, 18 king g1, knight e6, 19 king f1, h5, 20, king g2, king c4, 21, king f1, king d5, 22, king e2, king takes c6. Black has realized his objective. He has won White's protected passed pawn, but his doubled e-pawns don't offer a passed pawn of his own. To win the game, Black has to go back to the c4 square with his king. That means coordinating with the knight to force White's king back. 23, king d2. The best defense. White has to stop the black king march. King c6, d5, c4. 23, knight g5. 24, king c2, king d5. 25, king b3, knight f3. 26, bishop c3, h4. The g3 pawn stops the h5 pawn from going through. Now the f2 pawn not only protects the e3 pawn, it also has to stop the g4 pawn from promoting. This spells double trouble for the f2 pawn. 27, g takes h4, knight takes h4. 28, bishop d2, knight f3. 29, bishop c3. White has no choice. If 29, bishop c1, knight e1, and knight e1 d3 would win the f2 pawn. 29, knight g1, 30, bishop d2, knight e2. Which means that White is compelled to make a bad move. White would prefer to pass, but is forced to make a move. However, any move he makes weakens his position. Thus, he is in Zugzwang. 31, king c2, or 31, bishop e1, knight c1 check, 32, king c3, knight d3, reaching a killer outpost. White would be forced to give up either his f2 or b4 pawn. King c4. At last, Black has made inroads with his king. Now, using a coordinated attack of king and knight, the b4 pawn must fall. 32, bishop e1, knight g1. 33, bishop d2, knight h3. 34, bishop e1, knight g5. And White gave up. He is helpless to prevent knight g5, e6, c7, d5, takes b4. While the winning process was a long one, it showed the way that a knight can dominate a bishop, and vice versa. A fine example. What is White's material-gaining move here? Correct. White to move. What is a desirable knight maneuver? You got it right. What is a desirable knight maneuver? That's correct. Black to move. Move a piece to create a family fork. Correct. What is a desirable knight maneuver? That's right. Knight d2, moving him from b1 to d2, and then to b3 and up to c5. How should white continue?
That's correct.
After king takes h8, what next?
You got it right.
In the opening, after 1d4, knight f6, 2c4, e5, 3d takes e5, knight g4, 4 knight f3, knight c6, 5 bishop f4, bishop b4, check, 6 knight b d2, queen e7, 7 a3, knight g takes e5. What prevents white from capturing the bishop? a3 takes b4.
That's right.
Another opening, 1e4, c6, 2d4, d5, 3 knight c3, d takes e4, 4 knight takes e4, knight d7, 5 queen e2. Why can't black develop knight g8, f6?
That's correct. White to move. Move a piece to set up for a smothered mate. You got it right. After the computer has moved, make the follow-up move. Continue. That's right.